Hi, I'm Rebecca Kuang, author of Taipei Story.
Hi, I'm May Chen. I'm Rebecca's editor. Hi, Rebecca. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'm so excited to talk about Taipei Story publicly because I know this is something you've been laboring over for quite a while, so thank you. I have a few questions for you because I know a lot of readers are going to be vastly interested in the thought process and the inspiration behind Taipei Story. And I feel, having been privileged, been able to read this book before so many people, it feels like most of your books so far have been written more outwardly into history, satire, myth. Is Taipei Story a novel that was written more inward? Did that take a different set of skills from you?
Both yes and no. I think Taipei Story, actually, just like all of my other novels, is written outwards into a genre that I'm interested in. So there were a lot of literary templates for this book. I love Ben Lerner's Leaving Atocha Station. I love Elif Batuman's novel, The Idiot. And I was studying these novels that are so good with wordplay and also at exploring ways in which being bad at a language could maybe make you better as a person if you acknowledge that lack of fluency and sit in that vulnerability, those spaces of mistranslation and misunderstanding. So I was studying the way that really they shape their sentences and thinking about that as a template, which makes it easier than I think the project of taking all this inchoate grief and anguish and frustration and trying to make it something without some kind of formal model. So I ended up doing with this book the same thing I do with all of my other books. I find a canon and a set of texts that I want to be in conversation with, and then I sort of insert myself outwards instead of just tunneling inside.
Oh, I love that. And I really love how you explain that. So it's interesting. So you do absolutely feel like this is just part of the natural progression of your works, of your body of works, in terms of where this sits. Because some people can say, out from the outside looking in, Katabasis was so different from Taipei Story, and Yellowface was also so different. But ultimately, where Taipei Story fits amongst these recent books, it's true. Katabasis had two students also dealing with magic and the language of the magic spells that they cast, like the Latin and the philosophers. And Yellowface, how would you compare Taipei Story with Yellowface?
So both of my literary fiction books have been my humor books. I think Yellowface is very funny, and I like to write things that are like inherently ridiculous and hilarious, but I think that the humor in Yellowface is very mean-spirited. It's based on jealousy. It's mean girl
Yeah, it's
humor.
great.
You're laughing. It's all Schadenfreude, so you're laughing
Yes.
from the cringe and from just sort of having a place to vent all these nasty emotions.
I think one thing with Yellowface, just it's so funny that you said the nasty funny, because you felt bad for enjoying what was going on, but it was so delightful and yummy at the same time because you're like, oh my god, you totally deserve this, but this is so amazing. Yeah.
No, so it's fun to laugh at in
Yeah.
the gossipy way. And I think Taipei Story is different because it's also, well, it's a very sad book. It's about grief and death and mortality, but I mean, I think those things are funny. I think laughing through grief is really important. So I also think this is my most hilarious book, but the tone of the humor is different. This is a book without a villain. There's no bad guy. There's just people being absurd and ridiculous and living their lives, and sometimes there's friction, but ultimately there's no antagonist here. So the type of humor is this very, I think, like uncanny Wes Anderson-esque, charitable, generous humor that acknowledges life is messy and things don't go as planned, and there's all this delicious friction and awkward pauses and just the gap where what you're trying to get across is not communicating or translating for another person and vice versa. So I lingered in, again, that vulnerable space of misunderstanding, which is both hilarious and beautiful.
Yeah, no, I agree that there really isn't a villain, which I really like those kinds of books because you really have to treat each character as as much as possible as like a real human, because all these characters have their pluses and minuses, right? The protagonist in the story, you would think when you first read it, like, oh, okay, it's just going to be a glorious coming of age. She's going to navigate all these situations and be put into these horrible situations, but she's also complicit in her behavior and how she interacts with all these different characters. And it's funny because she's just figuring it out just like all of us, right? Okay, so book is called Taipei Story. Why the Taipei location specifically, and what does that city hold that nowhere else could?
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts about this.
Oh
I
my
think
God, tell me.
Taipei and Taiwan as a country has such an outsized position in the really like hegemonic imperial imaginaries of three competing empires in the Japanese imagination, in for mainland China and for the US as well. And it's this place that has gone through so much successive colonial rule, that has been continually denied self-determination, that still exists under threat of occupation. And so I think it's been fetishized by a lot of geopolitical and historical perspectives. And for, contingency of history, it's also weirdly the place that a lot of American scholars go to learn traditional Chinese language and culture and history, etc. So I wanted to write about this place that comes loaded with expectation, on which so much has been projected and so much has been misinterpreted, and sort of avoid the really romantic or fetishistic obsessions that so many other people writing about Taipei will, I think, like historically have unwittingly carried over to the island.
So I would probably say, is this your most personal book to date? And if so, does that kind of feel scary to you? To put so much of yourself into this book?
I think, of course, it was sort of terrifying because I was working through so much grief and I think family history. There's a lot of stories that don't belong to me that get interpreted through the book. But like with everything I write, there is that protective distance of fiction. I know it's being talked about as an autobiographical novel, but it's very much not autobiography. It's inspired by personal experiences and feelings that I had, but then they're stretched and exaggerated. And I write what suits the plot, not what I went through on a day-to-day basis. And I think an interesting additional barrier is the space of time. So far with most of my books, my protagonists have aged with me. When I started writing the popular trilogy, I was a teenager, Rin's a teenager. Then in Babel, the main characters are college students. In Yellowface, they're in their late 20s. In Katabasis, they're graduate students. And then with Taipei Story, there's a good decade that separates me and Lily, who is a college freshman. So I get to write with this sort of the hilarious hindsight of recognizing how silly and how naive, like how much I didn't know. So much of the exposition is filtered through Lily's eyes, and she doesn't understand geopolitics. She's confused about everything. She's constantly getting things wrong. And much like the protagonist in Elif Batuman's novel, The Idiot, which is also a coming-of-age story about a college freshman, there's just so much humor in taking the lofty, like, philosophical theories that they're learning about in class and trying to apply it to their everyday life.
When you're that age, especially when you're a smart 17, 18-year-old, which Lily clearly is because she is, undergrad at Yale, right? You do feel like, oh, I know everything. I'm going to be this big fancy grown-up. I'm going to travel abroad and take this immersion program and I'm going to find myself. But then you realize you're put in the situation that you've never been in before, whether it's a foreign language, which is a new situation. You realize, I don't know more things than I do know, right? And which is the way it should be.
Yeah. Lily's totally unmoored, and it was nice to write from the perspective of truly knowing nothing.
Yes, right. I also know that you said this is not an autobiography, but I would say a large reason why you wrote this, especially the grief component, is because you unfortunately lost your grandfather while you were in Taiwan, and you had to, obviously unpack all of that. If your grandfather was still alive today, do you feel like this book would resonate with your grandfather? Do you feel like, were there any particular scenes that you felt like you were writing for him or that he would connect with?
There is this one chapter, and you know
God,
the
don't
one
make
I'm
me cry.
talking about.
I know, don't make me
It's
cry.
the one chapter written from his point of view.
Yes.
And I would just really love to know if he thinks that's right.
Yeah.
If that's true to his experience or how he thought about his life.
So who did you write this book for? Why did you decide to write this book?
I think at first I really was just writing it for me.
Yeah.
I think writing fiction is how I process
Was it
everything
catharsis
difficult.
a little bit?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like with Katabasis as well. I wrote that when I was really depressed and my husband was really sick, and with everything
I was wondering about that. Yeah.
No, I mean, writing what I'm feeling, it doesn't make the grief go away. It doesn't make things any easier, but it just helps me understand myself. It makes me legible to myself, and I think that, helps me keep going. So at first I was just writing it to process everything I was thinking about, but then I was turning it into work of fiction. It became really something for anybody who has lost a loved one or who has gone through this type of grief, this feeling of detachment or estrangement from their family history. And I'm really glad that it's finished in the form that it is, which is also like very heartfelt and hilarious, because I think the worst thing when dealing with grief is when people walk around eggshells around you, when people just go silent because they're afraid, I don't want to say the wrong thing, so there's nothing to say. But actually, like, having gone through the grieving process, like more recently in the last few years, I appreciate being able to laugh at it. Like, I like when people make like impolite jokes or like just like really like black humor.
I was just gonna say you like a little bit of the black humor. Yeah.
But like, otherwise you just suffocate. So you have to open up and you have to be able to laugh at loss together. That's the only thing that helps you keep breathing.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. Which brings me, I think I know how you're gonna answer this, but what do you want readers to feel after they finish this book? What do you want them to take away from this?
I think the main thing is, like with grief, we're always afraid of saying the wrong thing. You don't want to be insensitive. You want to use exactly the right phrasing. And it's similar to how, when I was learning Chinese to speak with my grandparents, I was so anxious about my accent.
Yes.
I was worried about the wrong phrasing or just being clunky grammatically. So I put off all these intimate conversations because I thought I need to wait until I can say the perfect thing. But that time's never going to come, and you're never going to say the perfect thing. So I was writing myself into a place of being comfortable with messiness and vulnerability, and just like being willing to mess up all the time and accepting what comes with that, rather than being closed off to the world and trying to be this like perfect little ice sculpture.
Yeah.
So I hope everybody who reads it melts and is gooey and messy instead of icy and detached.
I think they will. I can't wait for readers to read this book and experience it for themselves, and not just listening to us talk about this book from a distance, because it is a very special book. And I love how you leaned into the messiness. I love that, because if you keep waiting for the perfect moment when you're the perfect speaker, the perfect student, in order to do the next step, you'll never get there, because there's no such thing as perfection. There's only the striving towards perfection. But while you're striving for it, you should be doing, right? It's the only way we can grow in our experiences and our people. And also, I honestly feel like book over book, and I think it's because you were a child when you wrote your first book, a literal child. And now, my God, you're almost 30. That's insane. Your craft has grown alongside with the books that you've written, and I feel like you tackled on even more nuance and complex and deep subject matters, and then you put it together in such beautiful books. So thank you so much, Rebecca, for writing this treasure of a novel. I can't wait for
editing it.
Easiest job in the world. I'm so lucky.